I very heavily hinted towards making an Elden Ring video, and after completing it yesterday, the first thing that came to my mind is how much I want to talk about it. Yet after writing down a list of all the things I loved about it and all the things that I really hated, I ultimately realized that I really can't properly criticize this game until I go back and play through every other Dark Souls game that has come out before. Everybody sort of agreed that Elden Ring is more than just a spiritual successor, it is quite literally Dark Souls 4 at this point. And even though I have some experience with the other games, it's not as much as I wish I could have before making a video on this game. I've played through Dark Souls 1 and I've played through a good portion of 3, yet I plan to play through 1, 2, and 3 in its entirety and then another playthrough of Elden Ring before I ever think of touching this game ever again. Despite that though, I think a lot of my initial reaction to this game, especially for my first playthrough, can be sort of condensed into at least a shorter video. As much as I like to make another, 40-hour video on this game, I think it's important to sort of take a breath. Hell, all the other games I've reviewed on this channel, for the most part, were out for more than a year before I ultimately made the video. Taking a deep breath and sort of being able to take everything in allows you to review the game much better, in my opinion. Hey, one of my favorite videos on Elden Ring that I think holds up especially if you've beaten the game, by Patrician TV, has this one line where he says this.
This video is difficult because the game is so new. People are treating it now like people treated Dark Souls 3 at this same point after its launch. It wasn't until a month or two had passed that people started being able to actually articulate that game's problems.
And I completely agree. Hell, right after I wrote all of my notes on the game after I finished it, just a few hours later, Joseph Anderson published a video on the game. And from the little bit that I've seen, he obviously is criticizing it a lot more than other game journalists have. The more famous and the bigger a game gets, the more important it is to criticize it with all honesty. And again, as I said, I'm probably not going to dive too in depth. In fact, a lot of the things I say in this video are probably going to be quoted directly in my later video on this game. But nonetheless, I think my first impressions are really interesting. So don't expect any big masterpiece, this isn't well scripted. In fact, I'm going off book and off script for a majority of this video. And I just want to divide my experience into two simple categories. What I enjoyed, and most importantly, what I didn't enjoy. So I guess let's start off with the pros. This segment's probably going to be very short and going to be a very small majority of what I'm focusing on, so let's just get it out of the way, I guess. So this game is definitely much easier and accessible, which is great. That's one of the first big things of praise that everybody gave this game. Probably the biggest thing that I noticed was that they deleted boss rushes. So basically, before many bosses, you'd have to go through a few enemies. For instance, a Taurus demon in Dark Souls 1, it's just a huge gauntlet, and then you get to the boss, and then if you die to the boss, you have to go through all those enemies all over again. It was never really something about skill, it was just fluff. And so it being out of the picture here not only takes out a lot of annoying bits, but it also allows us to really focus on the boss fights and have fun. The summons and multiplayer is really well implemented. So basically you can summon like ghost characters to help you out throughout the game. They're really useful, and then also of course you can summon other players to help you out. I use this a little bit, and in fact I do kind of regret using it for a few bosses, where basically I was just able to cheese the boss because I had friends there to help me. But nonetheless, the entire game is, I'd say, generally easier than what I was expecting. That's both really good and I think sometimes a little bad. It's easier for a lot of reasons, and some of them are good and some of them aren't, but that's going to be in the con section, so wait for that. The open world is also vast and fun to explore, especially the beginning portions. The starting area of Lingrave is very, very dense with things to do. There's so many side bosses and things to explore. Yet as the game goes on, they do sort of fizzle out the amount of density that there is. This was a problem that I had near the end, but for the most part, again, especially early game, they did this really well. Oh, and yeah, the game looks amazing visually in my opinion. It feels great to cast spells, hit things, dodge and block. It feels exactly like what I'm used to. The story is fun and has some great content for people to dig apart. Very similar to other FromSoft games, and I'm never really a huge fan of the story. In fact, I didn't really follow it that well here. I have some issues with the quests and stories later, but for the most part, again, there isn't really that much to criticize. Summoning friends for bosses actually makes the bosses a little more difficult, so summoning friends maybe isn't always the best route. The game, for me at least, in terms of how much fun I had, especially on this first playthrough, definitely makes it like a 9 out of 10. This is my favorite video game I've ever talked about on this channel. But even then, it has some huge broad issues. The game is fun, it has some fun aspects. Everything that I find annoying with the game either was in very particular instances or were broad things that lasted the entire game. Because of that, it's kind of hard to pick apart. Of course, this is a spoiler-free review, so I'm not really going to be saying anything specific, but I guess I'll talk about my initial critiques. As you can tell, again, that segment was very short. My initial praises are very vast, but there isn't much to talk about other than, well, I had fun. So now, let's get into the fun part.
You done fucked it up!
Okay, so my core critiques have to do with the pacing. I'm not going to go too specific, even though I can definitely critique every single bullshit boss and moment, but nonetheless, I think the overarching pacing throughout the entire game is sort of messy. Okay, so as I mentioned, the game is probably a lot easier. This opens up a lot of cheesability, and I don't know why, but it sort of makes every single boss a little bit less refreshing and enjoyable. Okay, so first of all, there's a lot of different skills you can abuse. My main sword, one of the most famous in the game, Blasphemous Blade, has a really crazy special ability that allows you to cheese many bosses. I ended up even having to stop myself from using it so I can actually have a fun fight. Not to mention, because the game is more accessible and easier, I think it pushed them to make even harder bosses. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, basically everything other than the bosses themselves have become easier, and so to sort of step it up and make a little bit of a change, I think they stepped up the difficulty of the bosses in general. This is through something that I'll mention earlier about annoyingly aggressive bosses, but that's more something that I'll cover on its own. Okay, and then you have the smithing stones. So basically, many other Dark Souls games, especially the one that I've actually beaten, Dark Souls 1, has a very simple upgrading process. As the game goes on and as you're able to explore more and more areas and as your skills get better, you're able to upgrade your weapons with more and more things. There's not really that many different things to upgrade your weapons. Basically, in the last main areas of the game, you're able to unlock a blacksmith and basically be able to grind and upgrade your weapon all the way. This works very well because generally there aren't that many difficulty step-ups, there are not that many skill progressions to go through. But now in this game, because it's so open, there's so many huge areas, this game is massive. They need to make many different ways to upgrade your weapons, and because of that, there's basically a ton of these things called smithing stones. There's smithing stones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, dragon smithing stones, it's crazy. There's even somber variants, so basically another entire set for special weapons. I stuck with the somber smithing stones, and also I think these were a lot easier to upgrade your weapons with than regular ones. But nonetheless, throughout the game, you're constantly having to find different types. For instance, I hit a brick wall forever where I didn't have any somber smithing stone 7s, but I had a ton of 8s and 9s. I was just confused, like this is not really paced that interestingly, and it allows these mess-ups to happen. Every Elden Ring fan right now is going to reply with, well, you can get bell bearings and purchase all the smithing stones you could ever possibly need. Again, this is sort of what they do instead of a blacksmith where you can purchase things like in other Dark Souls games, where here, as you continue in the game, you can basically purchase more and more different types of smithing stones to upgrade your weapons even more and more. But the problem is, these things are very out of the way. They're not presented to the player, they're not really put in front of you and said, okay, you reached this part of the game, now you can upgrade your weapon this far. No, they're just to the side. And I think having secret things to the side is really important and fun, but having something as integral to upgrading your weapons and being able to, I don't know, experiment with different things, a big key component of these games, to the side, it makes it just, it's mind-blowing how annoying and frustrating it is. And then you also have Ashes of War, which are sort of weird compared to special abilities. These are magic abilities, they take FP or mana, and yes, it's interesting and they can do really interesting things, and I actually really enjoy that it allows for a lot of diversity in your builds, but nonetheless, I feel like there's just specific ones and specific abilities that are really broken. For instance, if I was having trouble with the boss fight, which I did a lot because, you know, this game can get pretty difficult, all I was looking for is, okay, how do I dodge this one move that I can't get down? But instead the tutorial is just, okay, come over here, get this broken weapon, get this broken thing, and boom, you can cheese the boss in 2 seconds. Like, what? I don't want to do that. This might not even be a problem with Elden Ring, it might be a problem with Souls games in general. Again, another reason why I want to play through all the games before really reviewing this game, but nonetheless, that was a huge issue that I had. Oh, and a big thing is that the open world fucks up the entire difficulty. Okay, so as you play the game, there's a ton of main bosses you have to complete. These main bosses were actually paced really well, and I was usually right at the perfect level or a little under-leveled as I was trying to beat these bosses, which was a lot of fun. It was exactly what you expect from a Souls game. Yet every single one of the optional bosses, except for maybe one or two, I was basically completely under-leveled or over-leveled for. So basically in this game, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of side bosses to do, which is so much fun. Even though some of them are sort of repeats, which is a little annoying, I still think that it's a great thing to have so many side things to do. But you see, for some reason, I never was at the perfect level for these bosses. Even early game, in the early game areas, I felt like many of these bosses were maybe a little too easy. And as the game continued, it only got worse and worse and worse. I'd go to an area, I'd say, oh, this is a side thing I didn't see. And then boom, I'm over leveled and can complete the boss really easily. Or I'll go to an area and say, oh, this is a really fun place as well. But the boss is way, way too difficult for me at that current moment. And so whatever, I'll step back, I'll take a breather, I'll upgrade my things, I'll come back later. But eventually, when I do come back, I'm usually either still under-leveled or now incredibly over-leveled. This is a big problem that I never really had in other games by From Software, because for the most part they were paced really linearly, and all the bosses for the most part were put in front of you at the perfect time. But here, you know, it's hard to do that in an open world game. And it really fucked up my experience. Because of this, really other than the main bosses, I wouldn't say that any of the side bosses are my standout favorites. Which in a game that relies so much on boss encounters, this isn't that good. There's so many different segments of the open world with so many different difficulties in one area that it's hard to know where to go. It's hard to probe what's a good place to go and what's not a good place to go. And so in the end, even though the open world is fun and amazing to explore, especially on your first playthrough, I can't lie and say that it was always a lot of fun, because truthfully it wasn't. Okay, so now annoyingly aggressive bosses, as I mentioned earlier, are a real problem. Sometimes this can be really good. For instance, one of my favorite bosses in the game, Godfrey, has a second phase that's really difficult. But instead of mashing my head against the brick wall, I said, fuck this, I'm gonna equip 2 swords instead of just 1. And boom, I was more aggressive, the boss was more aggressive, it was so much fun. Hell, up until the end of the game, having 2 swords instead of 1 and having no shield was my ultimate playstyle. And I think aggressive bosses in this nature can sometimes work, as I just described. But I think sometimes the bosses are just maybe a little too aggressive. Sometimes the bosses will swing over and over and over and over again, and you can't do anything. And then, okay, I guess I'll hit them, but no, they backed up, and now I can barely even heal in time before they're doing another volley. I'm not going to go on this tangent too much longer, because again, I want to play the other Dark Souls game and then come back to this point, but nonetheless, it was a big frustration I had. The quests also sort of suck. I got one of the lame endings because, you know, I couldn't really see what to do. This is a problem in many other Dark Souls games, but the thing is, those were really linear, and so for the most part, even if you missed quests, I didn't really feel that left out. But here, quests are a huge part of the game, especially with how open and how dense the world is. Yet, nonetheless, I didn't have fun having to go to the specific area to find the specific character to push forward their storyline. It's not something that I found fun, I'm sorry. Initially, I was like, oh, people are complaining so much about the quests, that makes no sense. But I still think that there's a huge problem with this. It honestly kind of ruined many parts of the game, as I felt like I was always missing something, but I didn't want to look up a walkthrough. That's not fun. On my next playthrough, I'm going to try my best to do this though, and so I'll see if it does sort of change a little, but who knows. Overall, there were so many amazing secrets I feel like I didn't visit on my playthrough. This game was fun, but there's a lot of problems, and I couldn't stop thinking, especially near the end. I was not satisfied somehow. The design of the game is made in a way that was really open and vast, yet the way that they implement old things back into this vast world isn't really that great. I'm just gonna end this video here. Again, this is very much so a first impressions video. I like this game a ton, and I really hope on more playthroughs I just enjoy even more. Thanks for listening to my ramblings. Again, as I stated in the beginning, this is one of my favorite games I've ever played, but I still do love to examine all the intricate problems. Like and subscribe, take care guys.